Battle of Lexington and Concord, 1775, Part 1. It was a cold, uneasy night in Massachusetts. The air hung heavy with tension, the kind that made dogs bark at nothing and candles flicker for no reason. Boston, that bustling port city now under the watch of British redcoats, had become a powder keg of resentment. The people, farmers, merchants, blacksmiths, and preachers, were no longer merely subjects of the crown. They were something else now. Something stirring. Something dangerous. For months, the relationship between Britain and her American colonies had grown brittle, like a rope stretched to the breaking point. Every new tax, every new law, the Stamp Act, the Tea Act, the Coercive Acts, had pushed ordinary colonists closer to open defiance. After the Boston Tea Party, King George III and Parliament decided they'd had enough of the rebellious spirit of Massachusetts. The harbor was closed. Soldiers patrolled the streets. And anyone who dared speak of liberty risked arrest. But the people didn't bow. They organized. Across New England, local militias began drilling, men who worked the land by day and practiced firing muskets by night. They called themselves Minutemen, because they could be ready for battle in a minute's notice. It wasn't just about protest anymore. It was preparation. The talk in taverns and churches had changed. It was no longer, what can we do to change Parliament's mind? But, when the fighting starts, whose side will you be on? And then came the rumors. By early April 1775, word spread that General Thomas Gage, commander of British forces in Boston, had received secret orders. The Crown had decided to strike first. Gage's mission, seize the colonial stockpile of weapons hidden in the countryside, particularly in the town of Concord, about 20 miles northwest of Boston. His men were to march there quietly, arrest any rebel leaders they found, especially Samuel Adams and John Hancock, who were believed to be staying nearby in Lexington, and crush this spark of rebellion before it could spread. But the colonists were watching. Boston wasn't just a city of soldiers. It was a city of spies. Every redcoat's move, every officer's whisper, was noticed by someone sympathetic to the Patriot cause. Among those keeping watch was a silversmith named Paul Revere, a man already known for his courage and patriotism. When word reached him that British troops were preparing to move, he didn't hesitate. On the night of April 18, 1775, Revere and a network of riders set out to warn the countryside. "The regulars are coming out," he shouted as he galloped through the darkness, hoofs pounding the dirt roads of Massachusetts. Lanterns flickered in farmhouse windows. Bells began to ring in distant villages. Across Middlesex County, Minutemen grabbed their muskets, kissed their wives, and stepped into the cold night. By dawn, the British force, nearly 700 soldiers, was on the move under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn. They marched in silence, their red coats gleaming faintly under the early morning sky. The road to Concord took them through Lexington, a quiet little town that would soon become the stage for the first shots of the American Revolution. When the troops arrived just before sunrise, about 70 colonial militiamen were waiting on the village green, led by Captain John Parker, a farmer, a veteran of earlier wars, and a man who knew what bloodshed looked like. He had told his men not to provoke the British, but not to retreat either. "Stand your ground," he said. "Don't fire unless fired upon. But if they mean to have a war, let it begin here." Those words, passed down through generations, would become the heartbeat of a new nation. The British soldiers approached in perfect formation, drums beating, bayonets gleaming. Major Pitcairn shouted for the colonists to disperse. The Minutemen stood still, hands trembling on their muskets. And then, in the morning mist, a single shot rang out. No one knew who fired it. Was it a nervous militiaman? A British soldier? Or just an accident? History never settled that question. But that sound, that one, sharp crack of gunpowder, changed everything. The British line erupted with gunfire. Smoke filled the air. Men screamed. The Minutemen scattered. When the smoke cleared, 8 colonists lay dead and several more were wounded. The British cheered and marched on toward Concord, thinking the rebellion had been crushed before it began. But they were wrong. The countryside was now fully awake. Bells rang from steeples. Drums beat in village squares. Riders carried the news in all directions. The regulars fired on our men at Lexington. By the time the British reached Concord, hundreds of armed colonists were converging from every direction, each one burning with anger, each one ready to fight. At Concord, the British divided their forces. One detachment went to search the town for hidden weapons, while another marched to the North Bridge, just outside of town, where a growing number of Minutemen were gathering. Among them was Major John Buttrick, a local farmer who would soon find himself leading men into battle against the most powerful army on earth. From the hill overlooking the bridge, the colonists watched smoke rising from the town. Someone shouted that the British were burning Concord. Whether it was true or not didn't matter, the sight was enough to push them over the edge. Buttrick gave the order to advance. The British soldiers on the bridge, surprised to see the colonists marching toward them in formation, shouted for them to stop. Neither side wanted to make the next move. The air was thick with fear and fury. And then, once again, a single shot broke the silence. History would later call it, the shot heard round the world. This was not a riot or a skirmish anymore. This was war. Musket fire exploded on both sides. The Minutemen, hidden behind trees and stone walls, fired with deadly accuracy. The British fell back in confusion. When the smoke cleared, the colonists stood victorious, not just at the North Bridge, but in spirit. They had faced the mighty British Empire and held their ground. The retreat to Boston that day would become a nightmare for the Redcoats. Along every stretch of road, from Concord to Lexington and beyond, angry colonists fired from behind walls and fences. The British, exhausted and demoralized, would lose dozens of men before they reached the safety of the city. But that is a story for the next part, the long, bloody march back to Boston, and the moment America realized there was no turning back. Part 2. The sun climbed higher over the Massachusetts countryside, its light glinting off the muskets, bayonets, and the broken glass of shattered windows. The smoke of gunfire still hung heavy in the spring air. At Concord's North Bridge, the impossible had happened. Farmers and blacksmiths had stood their ground and driven back the king's soldiers. The men who'd fought there weren't professional soldiers. They were ordinary colonists, fathers, sons, tradesmen, and clergymen. But in that moment, something inside them had changed. They had fired upon British troops, their own government's army, and spilled royal blood on American soil. The rebellion was no longer talk. It was reality. As the British regrouped in Concord, confusion rippled through their ranks. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Smith and Major John Pitcairn were shocked by the ferocity of the resistance. These weren't frightened farmers. They were organized, defiant, and determined. The British had come expecting to scatter a mob. Instead, they'd ignited a revolution. Around 11 a.m., Smith gave the order to retreat toward Boston. The soldiers began their long march eastward, forming up in columns, their red coats shining in the midday light. But the march would soon become a desperate struggle for survival. Because by now, the entire countryside was alive. The church bells that had sounded in the night had done their work. Minutemen from dozens of towns, Bedford, Acton, Lincoln, Sudbury, Lexington, and beyond, had answered the call. From every direction, they converged on the British route, taking up positions along the roads, behind trees, stone walls, barns, and fences. They didn't wait for orders or formations. They fired from concealment, striking and vanishing like ghosts. The British soldiers, weighed down by heavy packs and thick wool uniforms, were already exhausted. They'd been awake for more than 24 hours, marching nearly 20 miles since midnight. Their gunpowder was running low. Their officers shouted for discipline, but the sound of gunfire echoed from every direction. At Miriam's Corner, just outside Concord, the colonists struck hard. From both sides of the narrow road, musket shots tore into the British column. Soldiers fell. The redcoats returned fire blindly, hitting few of their unseen attackers. Panic spread through the ranks as more militiamen appeared ahead. Every farmhouse, every rock wall, every thicket seemed to hide a rifle barrel. The retreat quickly turned into chaos. One British soldier later wrote, "We were fired on from every house, barn, wall, and tree, and were so fatigued that we could not keep up." By the time they reached Lexington again, the same village green where the first blood had been spilled that morning, the British were nearly spent. The dead and wounded lay along the roadside. The smell of gunpowder and smoke filled the air. What had begun as a proud military expedition now resembled a shattered retreat. But just when it seemed the British column might collapse entirely, salvation arrived. Around 2 p.m., nearly 1,000 fresh troops under Lord Hugh Percy marched out from Boston to meet them. Percy's men brought artillery, 2 6-pound cannons, and enough discipline to restore order. They formed a defensive square around Smith's battered soldiers, allowing the retreating column to rest briefly in Lexington. Lord Percy, surveying the exhausted and wounded men, is said to have remarked in disbelief, "Whoever looks upon them will think that they have been at the gates of hell." The rest wouldn't last long. The militiamen were closing in. From the surrounding woods and hills, new groups of armed colonists appeared like waves. The British began to march again, this time under constant harassment. From Minutemen, modern-day Arlington, to Cambridge, the running battle continued. Every step of the road back to Boston became a gauntlet of fire. The colonists used the landscape to their advantage, firing from windows, behind trees, and over stone fences. The British, furious and frightened, burned houses in retaliation, believing snipers hid inside. At Jason Russell's house in Minutemen, one of the bloodiest clashes of the day occurred. Russell, refusing to flee his home, loaded his musket and joined his neighbors in firing from the windows. When British troops stormed the house, a brutal close-quarters fight broke out. By the time it ended, 12 colonists lay dead, including Russell himself, who was bayoneted beside his doorway. The day that had begun with a single mysterious gunshot at Lexington had now become a rolling, merciless battle stretching across miles. When the redcoats finally reached the safety of Charlestown, just across the river from Boston, the sun was sinking low. The retreat had taken nearly 10 hours. More than 270 British soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. The colonists had lost around 90 men, but they had done the unthinkable. They had stood against the most powerful army in the world, and won. As the British regrouped in Boston, their officers tried to make sense of what had just happened. This was supposed to be a show of strength, a simple mission to seize weapons and arrest a few troublemakers. Instead, it had become a humiliation that sent shockwaves across the empire. For the people of Massachusetts, it was a day of both grief and triumph. The dead were buried with solemn honors. Bells tolled in every town. Yet there was pride too, a fierce, rising pride that could be felt in every farmhouse and tavern. In the following days, militia companies from across New England poured into the area, surrounding Boston in a vast circle. What began as a handful of angry farmers quickly grew into a makeshift army, nearly 20,000 men encamped around the city. They dug trenches, built fortifications, and cut off British supply lines. Boston was under siege. The British army, trapped inside the city, realized that the colonies were no longer simply protesting taxes or trade laws. This was something far greater, a full-scale uprising. Meanwhile, riders carried the news across the colonies. Through Connecticut, New York, Pennsylvania, and down into Virginia, people gathered in churches and town squares to hear the story of what had happened in Massachusetts. The reports were breathless, electric, alive with the spirit of defiance. Shots fired at Lexington. The British retreated under fire all the way to Boston. The people have risen. In Philadelphia, where the Second Continental Congress was soon to meet, word of the fighting landed like a spark in dry grass. Men like John Adams, Thomas Jefferson, and George Washington now faced a momentous question: if this was war, who would lead it? But back in Massachusetts, there was no question. The farmers and craftsmen who had fought on April 19 already knew the truth deep in their bones. There was no going back to the way things were. The bridge at Concord, the Green at Lexington, and the blood-soaked roads between them had become sacred ground, the birthplace of American liberty. And as night fell over Boston, the British lit their campfires and tried to sleep. Beyond their lines, the glow of hundreds of other fires flickered in the hills, the fires of men who no longer called themselves subjects of a king. They were something new now. They were Americans. Battle of Lexington and Concord, 1775, Part 3. The night after the fighting was eerily quiet. The roads between Boston and Concord were littered with broken muskets, abandoned packs, and the faint, lingering smell of gunpowder. In the fields and along the stone walls, the fallen lay where they had fought. Farmers who had survived returned at dawn to carry their dead home, their faces pale with both grief and pride. No one yet called it a revolution. But everyone knew, something irreversible had happened. The British army, humiliated and bloodied, now huddled inside Boston, surrounded by thousands of angry colonists. General Thomas Gage, once confident that he could crush the rebellion with a few swift orders, now stared across the Charles River at a countryside that no longer belonged to him. Every hilltop around Boston flickered with campfires. The colonial militia, armed and determined, had formed a loose but growing siege. In a matter of days, the news raced across the colonies faster than anyone had imagined possible. Riders on exhausted horses galloped south through Connecticut and New York, carrying letters and eyewitness accounts. In taverns from Pennsylvania to the Carolinas, people crowded around to hear the words read aloud. The regulars fired first, the militia returned fire, the British fled under heavy attack. For many, the message struck like lightning: the war they had feared and debated for years had finally begun. In Philadelphia, members of the Second Continental Congress began to arrive just as the news from Massachusetts spread. The mood was electric, uncertain, and divided. Some delegates, like John Adams and Samuel Adams, believed the time for reconciliation had passed. Others, including John Dickinson of Pennsylvania, still hoped for peace. But as the reports poured in, describing farmers standing up to British regulars and forcing them back to Boston, the tone began to shift. John Adams would later write that the events at Lexington and Concord were like a spark that united the 13 clocks to strike as one. Even in distant Virginia, where spring fields were just beginning to bloom, the shockwaves were felt. George Washington, reading the accounts, quietly put on his military uniform when he arrived at the Congress. It was a gesture, a wordless one, that told his fellow delegates exactly where he stood. Back in Massachusetts, the siege of Boston tightened with every passing day. Volunteers streamed in from New Hampshire, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. They brought their own muskets, powder, and food, and a shared conviction that they were defending more than just their towns. They were defending the very idea of liberty. The British, trapped inside the city, still controlled the harbor, but little else. Supplies were scarce. Tempers flared. The redcoats, once the proud symbol of the world's greatest empire, now stared from behind their fortifications at farmers who had turned into soldiers. And those farmers were becoming organized. In early May, the colonists captured Fort Ticonderoga in New York, seizing valuable cannons and gunpowder that would soon be dragged across mountains by a young officer named Henry Knox. Around the same time, a tall, commanding man from Virginia, George Washington, was appointed commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. The colonies, once separate and uncertain, were now bound together by something powerful, a shared cause, a common enemy, and a leader who embodied their hopes. But in April and May of 1775, that unity was still fragile. The colonists had no navy, no treasury, and no trained army. What they had were words, words that gave shape to their defiance. Pamphlets circulated everywhere. Preachers thundered from pulpits that God himself had smiled upon the cause of freedom. Newspapers printed stirring accounts of the Minutemen who had stood their ground. The phrase, "the shot heard round the world," began to appear, first in poems, then in speeches, echoing the belief that the events of that April morning would change not just America, but all of human history. Even across the Atlantic, in London, Parliament was stunned. The idea that ordinary colonists, tradesmen and farmers, had dared to take up arms against trained British troops was almost unthinkable. But the reports could not be denied. King George III, upon hearing of the fighting, declared the colonies to be in open rebellion. He promised to send thousands of additional troops to restore order. But far from intimidating the Americans, the king's words only hardened their resolve. In Massachusetts, the siege around Boston grew into a sprawling encampment. Men slept under makeshift tents of canvas and hay. Women brought food and tended to the wounded. And at night, fires burned bright across the hills, a silent message to the world, "We are still here." One British officer, watching the glow from across the river, admitted grimly, "We may have burned a few houses, but we have kindled a flame that all the waters of the ocean cannot put out." That flame was liberty, and it was spreading. The colonists began calling themselves patriots. Their enemies, loyalists, clung to the crown, warning that rebellion would bring ruin. Neighbors argued in taverns, families split apart, brothers found themselves on opposite sides. The line between loyalty and treason blurred with every passing day. But for most, the time for hesitation was over. The British had fired upon American citizens. The question now was not whether to resist, but how far to go. In June, the tension reached a boiling point. The British, determined to break out of Boston, planned an assault on the colonial fortifications overlooking the city. The Patriots, now better organized, rushed to occupy Breed's Hill, mistakenly remembered as Bunker Hill. When the battle began on June 17, 1775, it was as fierce as any Europe had seen. British troops charged again and again up the hill under heavy fire. The colonists, running low on powder, waited until they could see the whites of their eyes before firing. Though the British ultimately took the hill, their victory came at a staggering cost, over 1,000 casualties. One British general admitted bitterly, "Another such victory would have ruined us." For the colonists, Bunker Hill proved something vital: they could fight the British army head-on, and survive. From that moment, there was no longer any illusion of reconciliation. The revolution had begun in earnest. And yet, even amid the blood and chaos, there was a sense of destiny, a feeling that history itself had turned a page. The farmers who had fired their muskets at Lexington and Concord hadn't just defended their towns. They had lit the torch of freedom. That torch would burn for 8 long years, through winters at Valley Forge, victories at Saratoga and Yorktown, and the eventual birth of a nation unlike any the world had seen. But every great story has its beginning. And for America, that beginning was April 19, 1775, a chilly morning on a small village green in Lexington, Massachusetts. A line of ordinary men stood shoulder to shoulder, facing the greatest army on earth. They didn't know how the day would end. They didn't know they were making history. All they knew was that freedom was worth fighting for. When that first mysterious shot cracked through the dawn mist, no one knew whose musket it came from. But the echo of it traveled farther than any bullet. It crossed the oceans. It echoed through the hearts of men and women yearning for liberty everywhere. It was the sound of a new world being born. The end. What are your thoughts on this topic? Let me know in the comments below. And of course, like and subscribe.